Tene ta tangbo chen namba kangala ta nangadu deli shogi la tene ta te jesu cherdo tanda chen namba ta tanda chu la lo tse te to del tene ngo ji tene nyamlin nang san ni nyamlin na chu hyo san ni chu hyo gom je san ni gom ja ta tende na wa te pe 나란서 께르도 제nom바 담비 주주고라 휴바데 메세 단단 담바제다 되는 미살게 다리 샤보카게 로제 제도 들네 담비주 냠린당 투섬마와데베 에 고갑상보 중화래라 되네 투지 체크기.
First of all, I'd like to wish everyone good morning. So for you all to come here and to really concentrate your minds on the Dharma here, to practice silence, to do your meditation practice, to do these studies, and to meditate in this way is really wonderful. In general, just entering the Dharma is a really great opportunity. It's something that really gives meaning to our human lives. And in particular here, during these few days, to really concentrate on the Dharma, to practice, and to study is an absolutely wonderful opportunity. So I'd like to thank you all very much.
Tene ta tanda chenombape kale mamboja tene rang leren ta nekap leren tenzo yo tombe chula ta chu nyembala pe tende sedu tela je gong mengon da boda nengo chimbon da boje togre somne rewata deba chimbonane pe tende nangdu tela tene kasen ngarange shya tela chirurbe tawandabo hi tene yeshu chulundabo hi nyentu ge tawandabo hi ta tende sedu je ta teda chose hiro chongwaso tene ngarange gong mengodabo yaboji toguji imbala tene yeshu chuludo tene ngansuge koranle twasaji hakokyore tene hi kurmare sabado tene yonsegre inaya taje tuntaga kori indi tela ti lojunda bo na pento chembo yongre sabado bojo.
So you all have really put a lot of effort into coming here. You all have a lot of things to do, and you've put them all aside for a few days. And when you come here, you think to yourselves, oh, I'm going to come, I'm going to listen to the Dharma teachings. I'm going to get these wonderful instructions on meditation. I'm going to really learn the important points about my practice. And so you have this real hope and this real faith that you're going to get these points. And then you come here, and what do I talk about yesterday? I talked about non-Buddhist philosophical schools. I talked about Christianity. And I talked about, the foundation vehicles of Buddhism. And you might think when you listen to this, well, man, what's the point in all that? I want these instructions on meditation. I know about Christianity better than he does. But still, actually, it is helpful. It is helpful to know a little bit about the history of the different schools and traditions.
Tene ta tanda cherdu karirisena ta je tawata tunta suso yorela tene perna do yeparanzamba ta do meparanzamba tene ta tende se do yeparanzena tene tawa te khandi imba ta tene tela namba sanji bala do meparanzambe ke tawa te chechu khandi imba ta tene ta te yendo tanda cherdo ngaracho ta tanda tene chirurge tanje ngubo ina ya yeparanzamba ta tene chiru jitante madru patoni dunzambata no seno dunzambata tenzo rimbi ge netsul ndaboti hi na tene gamde nyamnyong gten yung yorela nyamnyong gten yungdu tela tene tige tombo netang ye netang dabote kandre imbate tezi kowa gten ni hi ndabo yapo je na tene tela tene ingen zenje gam ge nyamnyong Kewe kapsala yung pento chenpo yung cherna, teni chetang Trungpa singkinte pe kal chenpo tong pento chenpo yung sare.
But the reason for this is that there are different views, there are different schools, different ways of presenting things. Sometimes it's presented that there is a self, sometimes it's presented that there is no self. And if it's presented that there is a self, then what is that view? And in the Buddhist schools, we present that there is no self. So what are the features? What are the particular features of that view? Similarly, we often think that there are objects, that there are things outside of ourselves. And so we might think that they really exist. Or we might have a view that says, a philosophy that says they don't really exist. They are emptiness. They cannot be established as anything. Or we might talk about all appearances as just being mental perceptions. And so if we know these views, if we understand what they are like, then when we are meditating and some sort of an experience happens, then first we will have already created a foundation. We'll have a basis of understanding the way things are, sort of a certainty in the way things are. And then when through our samadhi meditation we develop this experience, it's helpful for us in recognizing it. And so that is why it is so important and so helpful to study these different philosophical schools.
Tene ta terenge kapsula senzon pak tawa ye jurela. Senzon pak tawa ye patyan tanda nyintu ge dena deni ge tawa nila. Chepar kare yore se na teni ta chitang ge nyintu ge chige noa te teni rapa ge ondu se na zouji pumbo ya mambo ndubi pumbo ndabo je la koge ya patang nduje jingu po se na mambo ndune teni nang lutabu je yena yung go tang lakpa tang kangba tang tene nang nyain tang loa la soba mambo jen dune trupa yinba je tang tene che yoli yin na ya re tang cho tang nasa la soba mambo jen dune chunga yinba tang tene par ke kangba ndabo je yin na ya kawa tang duma tang to tang pangye la soba mambo jen dune chunga yinba tang tene pena motanda boje yena yung kolo ta tene lapi koya la soba mambo je zamne chunga yimbe chel ndu yin se pa tong phumbu ge namba la yore la ta ti phumbo ti ne ta ngoma te khande je la ngu zung ge yore se na tene tumbu mambo je zamne chunga yimbe chel tawa zunga dutrin chame dulting namba dul chunchung mambo je zamne chungwa zangire mato ngupo dodo ndabo chenpo je zesu trupa kanya yo mare pumbu namba re ngupo nguni ge yen ndabo te kande jire se na tene te tatanda dulting chami ge namba je dulting mambo zamne chungwa jire samne tena phagu yo re.
So today we have come to the discussion of the mind-only schools. And so now we have the mind-only schools. Yesterday we talked about the two schools of the foundation vehicle. And so you might wonder, what is the distinction between these two different views? What is it that distinguishes them? Well, when we talk about the views of the foundation vehicle schools, when they talk about the external objects, they say that the Course the gross external objects are the aggregate of form. And so aggregate of form, it means an aggregate, many things that are brought together, aggregated together. And so everything is made out of many different things brought together. If we think about our bodies, our internal bodies, they're made of many different parts. We have heads, we have hands, we have toes and fingers, and lungs and internal organs, and all these parts that are brought to that are combined together to make a body. Similarly, with external things like houses, or like mountains or rivers or forests, there are just many different things that are brought together, combined together to make an external thing. Or if we think about those things that are sort of in between the mountains and the bodies, like houses, a house has many different parts too. There's the foundation, the roof, the walls, the doors, and these are all brought together, put together and assembled into make the gross outer phenomena. So it is all of a whole bunch of different things that are brought together and made into aggregates. So everything has this aspect of being a conglomeration or an aggregate of other things. But what is the nature of these aggregates? Well, when we look at how these aggregates actually are, we see that there are many different things put together. And then if we look at them more closely, we see that we can divide them into smaller and smaller and smaller parts until we finally come down to these atoms that are just put together. And so if we think about it in this way, there are all these atoms, but the coarse form of the coarse external object, the gross objects that we see, cannot be actually established as anything. They do not substantially exist as gross objects. Rather, it is all these atoms. So the basis out of which all of these objects is made are these atoms, many of which are just gathered and conglomerated together.
Tenete Pumbo in Bijonsen, the Pumbo de Topa, Tona, Karepenge, you are na. Tachitang Upo Dodo, Taylan Zambachimboji, not till Chögyam Chimboji, Yungi or La, Tiniti, Chögyam de Pawa, Tinituma, Dupa, Nimbo Hiro, Mepa Dabojila, Tona, till Tezong, Chögyam Mepa. Chögyam Jivi Capsule Laya, Tangaransun, Zambakandi Yungi or Tombo Nga, Yambajin Zingayor, Da Yambajin Zingayor. Tela tene ne nyambache to dage sinkinche dot don zamba to dagrin zamba tene dot don zamba ina nga nyambata wuche to dagrin zamba ina nge lupo tene te zi chapche rusona tene nge kangba tene nge chaka nge ngupo tene nge tropo tene kapkala yan zindu tela senchilo balan zindu nge draw yin nga drawre sambandabo te yapo chawna magawa dubo chawna gawandabo ya yungsegi yore la tinde ke nomto ngamba yungi yore kapkala Chögyam ke namba yungi yore de nge chakayin de chodogre de rudogre sombege khencho yungi yore la dodo tanzaina tene tejendo tene tanda pe cherusona ne sasha ne jalkap ndabo tene tela tezi ne pandabo chona ya tela hedang jewa ta yabo chona tela hencha jewa la soba yungi ware la te mechewe kichedula te mechewe chedo tene pumbo zomdo to na te zom ge nimbo meba tela ne pandabo che shone rang daden sem bungu poche la te si tholanda poche chona ya ta nimbo meba re te re sombamato ta te ngal pe mesip dubo chongson sombe central ta dungal te zom mechewe chedo daden sem ba chung ge cherda dagren sem ba chung ge cherda hencho chung ge cherda te pumbo rakwa zo pumbo rakwa nimbo meba te na papa che ta tene Chögyam mepa che lanzai na tene gewa mepa digpa mepa ta teta bun zamba ge Chögyam Khenpo Ganshar Wangpo yore la teta bu meyong we cherto zunga dulchin chami zom te yu te zawanda bore ten zom ne ngopo kanga tuge yore tuji ondo se na kechi chami se du ta khasin nani lo dawa teni shaw keji ma mangbo yore la tina ni keji chami zong mangbo zom ni chungwa re ma do do ra bo shiro yo ma re samba zembe ke cherto teni ta phumbo zom to to ke cherta teni tan tamba chani zungwa durtin chami to hipa keji chami zom te zawan ra bo ji ye par hyal ji ye ne teni dungal je demba ton kunjum ge demba ton gop demba ton lam je demba nomba ye ne lu te tena phat na ma re.
So what is the reason for saying that everything is an aggregate? If we realize that everything is an aggregate, how does it help us? Well, when we think of an aggregate or something as being a solid thing, a real thing, then we often get really attached to it. We grasp at it. We're fixated upon it. And so in order to rid ourselves of such fixation, if we realize that actually it's just an aggregate of many different things, we realize that there isn't really anything there. There's no real essence to it. And so there isn't as much grasping at it. There's not as much attachment and fixation to it. And so when we are fixated to things, generally what we first get fixated upon the sense of there being a me, of there being a self. So we think there's a self, and then when we think of there being a self, we think of there being things that belong to the self. And so we have this idea of there being me and mind, so grasping to a self and that which is the self's thing. So grasping to me and mine, we think of my body, my house, my things, my friends, and so forth. And when we think of this wrongly, then we think that's my enemy. And when we think that that's my enemy, then when good things happen to them, we're unhappy. When bad things happen to them, we are pleased. And so we have this real attachment to things. When we think of something as being mine, we think of something valuable as mine, being mine, we're attached to it and fixed to it. And so we really fixate on these solid things that are truly existent, solid things. Sometimes we also think about, grasp onto larger things. We think about, when we think about my things, we think about my area, my town, my country. And then when even the slightest thing happens badly to our country, then we think to ourselves, this is bad, and we get angry about it. Or when something good happens, we get attached to that. We get excited and we get attached and fixated upon that. And so in order that we do not have that sort of attachment and fixation, if we realize that everything is just an aggregate, then we see that there's no real essence there. There's nothing to be attached to. We see all these things that we think of as mine, if we realize that all these things do not really have any essence, that they're just a bunch of things put together, then we have fewer worries about it. We have less suffering about it. So our fixation on things grows less. Our sense of there being mine, of being me, grows less. Our attachments grow less. And so we realize that they are just aggregates of things. But if we were to think that it's just nothing at all, that there is nothing at all, then there's the danger that we would get fixated on the idea that there's nothing, and we'd think that there is no virtue, there are no wrongs and no non-virtues. And so in order that we don't gain that sort of fixation, they teach that there are these schools teach that there is a basis for everything. All of the external objects we see are made up of indivisible atoms that are aggregated together. And in terms of time, there are the indivisible instants of time. And so any conception of a unit of time, such as yesterday or today, a year or a minute or whatever, all of this is just a many indivisible instants all brought together. There is no single thing, no solid thing that we can say is the time. It's just many things brought together. Everything is just an aggregate. And so when we realize this, then it helps us get rid of our fixation on things. So we realize that everything is made up of these indivisible atoms or of these indivisible instants of times. And these are like the basis for everything. And through meditating upon this, we can come to an experience of the truth of suffering and the truth of the origin, the truth of cessation, and the truth of the path. That is the Four Noble Truths. We can come to understand what the nature of the Four Noble Truths is.
Tene ta te la te ta te nintu pe ta wa da lombre la tene ta te la sensam pa namji khandi gong yo re sensam pa namji tene dultrin te la ta ji na kap so la dultrin tumbu tang ya me pa do do je chun chun je chu cha me pa je zan de won xie ge yo ma re so ne per na dultrin je la dultrin trup ge ko ro kap so la shar la chu pe ge cha da nub la chu pe ge cha la so pa ti su te ji tumbu da bo je won xie ge ma to zan ni ti chu je ma to me pa je won xie ge ma re la teacher na dultrin chami senkin ti zani truyo mare ta dulchin sinking de noa zongire per na molom je noa tabu je re mato tanto dulchin mambo sapata keji mambo sapatende tening upo dodo temperature ba ji zani yung mare go yung mutup ta ripati tangne tene chirul upo tenzo zuma dulchin chami ke namba la yo mare la nangi hipa tenzo keki chami ke namba la yo mepa tene tene kon nambe ke ta kare sensom be ke kare nangi yo are sena tene tanda ta chig no ate no du Chitang non sulti niente tardo ya so ge ware de te ina ya tan la demper trupatin de kan yo mare wona kan de thong ge ware se na no aton ji sem ji no wala ya ge ware no aton ji sem la ya ge ware per na mulam da bu ji yin na yo mulam la ren da bo ta kang ban da bo ta tening harang ge ngo hi ba da bo ta men da bo ta sen jin da bo mambo mulam tang re de yin na yo te uni durthin durtba yo mare la tini te charne charge yo re te kana charge yo re sin senjing wala te tende che charge yo re pe te yendo tanda yo aran so senjing wala no ati charge yo re charge yo pa te la tini sensom pe dubzi ge rikpa te la khari yo re sin salhin rikpa ta se tang aran so ngupote rendrabo tang kangbandrabo yote yepi junsin kari yo re sin ngi sengola ngi hipala hargi yo re sombaji mato te junsin ngi hipala mahar we ngupote tenya yo marela dis nang aran so senji no re somne no aton ji senon to tena phagi yo re la teni tige chu chinong ge chu tom ji jitang ge dendrup da bo mepa teni ngarang ge sen la hargi yo re somne tena pa nang.
So that is the view of the listener schools of the foundation vehicle. So what is the mind-only presentation of this? How do the mind-only people present this? Well, they say that when you analyze all these indivisible atoms and so forth, and when we look at that, you come down to the smallest possible atom. There's no way there can be a partless atom, actually, they say. And the reason is that if you like, for example, if you have one atom and it's combined with other atoms, say it's surrounded by 6 other atoms. So you've got this one atom surrounded by 6 other atoms. There's one on the east, there's one on the west, and so forth. And the one on the, and so in this way, it's like that one in the center now has an eastern side facing the east, one western side facing the west. It has to have all these different sides, otherwise the atoms wouldn't be able to work together. They wouldn't be able to fit together. So there's no way that there could be an atom that would only have one side and no parts. They all have to have different parts facing the different directions. So there's no way that there can be any indivisible atoms, because you can always divide them up into the directions, into the different sides. In the same way, the atoms are, and so when they all appear, they appear, but the appearance is just like the appearance of the dream. There's nothing actually really there. And so in this way, the indivisible atoms can't really be absolutely true. And it's the same when you have the indivisible instants of time. They cannot really work out. There's got to be a beginning and an end to that instant. Otherwise, all the instants would work together. So actually, all the instants would just be one instant. There wouldn't be any way for them to combine and make longer periods of time. So there's no actual true thing that can be established as an instant or as an atom. And so they prove this through the logic. And so what they say is that in terms of external things, there are none of the indivisible instants. In terms of the internal mind, you cannot break it down into these indivisible instants of time. So what is it that the mind-only school says? Well, the mind-only school says is that when we have the experiences, the appearance of external things, they appear as they're explained to appear on a relative level by the Sutra school and the Great Exposition school. But actually, in terms of their real ultimate nature, there's nothing really there. There's no real substance there. So all of the appearances are just the mind. And so when things appear to the mind, when the mind perceives things, it is like the perception in a dream. When you have a dream, you can see all sorts of things. You can see a mountain, you can see a house, you can see your acquaintances, you can see you can see people, you can see animals, and these all appear. But as they appear, they cannot be established as anything being really true. So they appear, and of course they do. So all the external appearances do appear. Of course they do appear, but they appear only as perceptions of the mind. And so when they appear as the mind, then in terms of the mind-only logic, this is called the proof that there is of clear awareness. So when everything appears, they all appear to the mind. So there's nothing that can exist or appear without appearing to the mind, without appearing to a mind. If something does not appear to a mind, there's no way you can say that it's actually exist or that it's appearing. And so in that way, all things, all appearances are just the mind. And so in this way, they come to comprehend and establish that all appearances are just the mind, and that there's nothing about them that can be truly established. They just occur in the mind.
Tene tate tardo dotrin rangime paten la phabge yorela ti dotrin rangime paten la phapa yendo perna seripa physics ge ta chi sit nam kapsala ta tinde dotrin te rangime pato ge yore singin da ta tinde ngarang ko son la tin salbone chera namba ke gre tene ta te tabu ge nyeden te da senjang paton uma pe ten la papa dutrin rangin me pa duzi ge ripa nyeden ta bote phachir chikpa ndabo yung me roi ndabo tinde samsong la tene phachi yung yo da sambare ta tela tene ngaranso nyomling ge kapsala khandi resena shaje chimpo gamba kapsala na tene no asem 다 찾아진보 내는 장수가 논도 순들들 당보 감рем가 온도스는 노아셈 셈 동바 흔루 론도 동어때 봤을 때 텐디 상요와래라 당보 노아셈스 희구요 노아셈스 모때 바테다 단다 센점비 노아셈스 리피트 두바니 찍바 리베스는 찍바 말해 no sense ngotre pati nguni nawa ke tain to te gamne ta ti senje no imbala te nyam se nyone zikpati la no sense ngotre pare re te yina ya ti no sense ngotre pati yen rabote country rindo te tanda sense on pe gibog repeat ne ten la papa ka so no te chirul yo mare 당가란서 기탄 그 뒤전도 송타나 노아티 세마레 치르르 넘발레 요아레 데 락바 뎀바 무부 요아레 삼바 요아레 데 이나야 데 센섬페 리피게 드롭운드 노아탄지 센임발라 리피두기 요아레라 Tene te drupa yendo gambi nyansi nyong kapsula yang ta sensampi ripi drupi nenga dabo te ta tende rinduwa sambate nyom nyong ka tena papa yinbe cherna tene shaja chimpo gamba kapsula yang shaja chimpo to zopa chimpo gamba kapsula yang sensam ka tawa te pe kal chimpo yin pen topo yin yin na yang tini ngo chikpa ripi sina ngo chikpa mare tene shaja chimpo te ngansam ka nyom nyong ka teni yung ka yuware shazu ka menga te yung 요아래라 단다 되네 다 센섬비 지포 그때나 파파티 다 빼나 잡니 라비 뉴데바나 힌다부지 하나 초소다고 지포 그때나 파고 요아래 마도 운니 냠스뇽기요 마레테 이나야 자위기 예데 고아게 때나 파두양 이히제지야 요아래라 딩이히 디게때니 검나 니사나제 용기 요아래라 드니디 검다 저바 침보 인세네 노한거 오마징게 저바나라야 센섬베타와티 쇼조게 맹월라요 베펜토 침보 갈 침보레 이나야 데 추탐지 네루 지바르베세나 마리 응나와 타와레
And so in this way, the mind only establishes that the indivisible atoms do not exist by their nature, and so in doing this, through meditating upon this, you can come to realize that that all atoms, that atoms and so forth, do not naturally exist. And so this is actually similar, I think, to what is said in science, in modern physics. They talk about all sorts of strange subatomic particles and things like this, and you probably know about this a whole lot better than I do. But I think, from what little I've heard, I think that these things, that the main points of the scientific presentation and the description of this in the mind only and the middle way is probably pretty much the same. I think it's basically coming down to the same point. You can't really establish that there are these particles, but you probably know this better than I do. Now, when we are actually doing our practice, when we are meditating on Mahamudra, often we talk about establishing appearance as mind. This is what is taught in the Ocean of Certainty. In the sequence of meditation taught in the Ocean of Certainty, it said first that we establish all appearances as mind, then we establish that mind is emptiness, we establish that emptiness is spontaneously present, and we establish that that spontaneous presence is naturally liberated. And so when we when first in the Ocean of Certainty, it says that we establish all appearances as mind. We come to see that, we know that, and we are pointed out. We recognize this. Now, is that recognition from Mahamudra of all of appearances being the mind the same as what we establish through logic and reasoning in the mind only? Well, it's not the same. Because when we are pointing out that all appearances are mind, then that is actually experiencing it through meditation, meditating on the basis of appearances and coming to real experience through your meditation that this really is the mind. And so that is recognizing that the mind, that appearances are the mind. But what is the basis for that recognition? Well, the basis is that first we need to understand through the mind-only logics that appearances are mind. So we understand this through the logic, and that all the appearances are not outside ourselves, but so the external appearances are just the mind. Normally, what we think is that the things that appear to ourselves, they aren't mind, they are outside of ourselves. There are gross things out there that are real, they're existing, they're things, and and we think of them in that way normally. But in the reasoning of the mind only, it proves through this reasoning that all these appearances are just mind. And so then when we establish that through the reasoning, and then we come to the to experience it in meditation. So we come to the meditation experience and we say, oh, that is exactly what they say in the mind-only school. So when we meditate upon Mahamudra and Dzogchen, then this view of the mind-only school is really very important, and it's also actually extremely helpful. So are these two things the same? They aren't the same, but when we have, when we develop the experience of the direct experience of this in Mahamudra through the instructions of Mahamudra and Dzogchen, then the view that we establish through logic in the mind-only reasoning is a really helpful support for this. It's like with that view, it's like we're not actually directly seeing it. It's like it's sort of peeking out from behind and waving its hand in a way. But so it's not an actual experience, but that basic understanding leads us to develop certainty. And then through that certainty, when we come to it in meditation, we can say, yes, that is what it means when it says that all appearances are mind. And so it really is connected with our meditation. As Mipham Rinpoche said in his commentary on the ornament of the middle way, the view of the middle way is very helpful. It's a very good support to this. Does this mean that the middle way school sees the true nature of all phenomena? It doesn't mean that. They do still say that there are things that truly exist. That's right. So in this way, the mind-only school is really very important for the meditation on Mahamudra and Dzogchen.
Dene ta tejendu ta tanda dene sona sensam pa nom do de sachu ba tong longkar hi ba su ji sun rang ne gon noa na zu ba tong ji sen je rol ba zong ne yin chedan pembu chu so ma du par de ba sensam ba ma du par de be sensam ba se sensam pa de tene sanji ge song kan teng ge yore se na do de sachu ba ta longkar hi ba la so ba ga tan do i tan la tene zo sanji ji sun do ten zu ge ji di gomba tan tamba no atan ji sanji no in ba la tena pa ge yore ta tanda kasin nyin tu ge tawa se ro na wa ton do de pa te ni di do kan ge ji sun rong ge yore se na ka ton ba den ba ye chu jing ko lu ge ji sun rang ne ta ti teng ge yore la ta te la tanda do de sa chu ba ton long kar hi ba la su ge ji sun rang ne teng ge yore tini sem chom sinkin te kan de se na tini chi no wa te yo ma re te yin ya nang sem chom je yo re ta te ya ta ngaran so la 당보 니 주던지 돈이 되나 되니 지미 좀이 게 제용 매베게 돈이 게 따완다고 제 도성 히 somsona 데데지 깝깔라 골산다 본로기 요아래라 데 분도 외쳐들라 동보 자와데 지루르 응우보데 드비오 마레데 낭게 셈 타와제 되네 자완다 보지 요아래 디 여발라 때니 드니 치게 노아데 샤르 드니 강가 노아데 샤르기 요아레신 셈점세 연다 덴버 트붕고 보카야 요 마레데 셈점게 요아레신 때나 바게 요아레 다 대야 지미 좀이 그 돈이 좀바 돈이 해본다 보jel라 문도 쳐들라 드니 다단다 sem zongji zawanda bojela zongni tawate tena papne ta ngaranso lejunde ta tene somni jela so batomchi ge zawate sem zomla tene yongge yobate tena papne tengi yore.
And so as it says here towards the bottom of page 2, the last paragraph on page 2, it says, partly through the fourth line from the bottom. It says, proponents of the mind-only school follow scriptures, such as the 10 levels, travels to Lanka, and so forth, and assert that all the various appearances are merely a display of mind and do not otherwise exist as external material phenomena. And so if you wonder which of the Buddha's words, which of the Buddha's teachings, which of his sutras are their teachings based upon, well, they're based upon the sutras, such as the Sutra of 10 Levels, the Travels to Lanka Sutra, the Lankavatara Sutra, and other such sutras. And so these are, when their teachings, in their presentation, they present things in according to these sutras. So they say that all appearances are just perceptions of the mind. Now, yesterday we talked about the views of the foundation vehicle, and there the sutras that they base their teachings on are the sutras of the first turning of the wheel of Dharma, that teach the Four Noble Truths and so forth. But here, the mind-only school bases their teachings on sutras of the third turning of the wheel, such as the Sutra of the 10 Levels, Travels to Lanka Sutra, and so forth. And so they're called the mind-only school. And when you say the mind-only, or some people also translate it as the merely mind school or merely mentalist. If you say it's the mind-only school, why do we say the mind-only? It's because they say that there aren't any external appearances, but there is just mind. There's merely mind. There is only mind. There are no external things, but there is just mind. If at the very beginning we are to say everything is emptiness, there's nothing exists at all. There is nothing at all, and people might think to themselves, "Oh, I've realized that view," and then they would have then there's some pitfalls that they might trap themselves in. And so that in order that they don't fall into those traps, we say, the mind only says that, okay, the external phenomena do not truly exist, but there is mind. There is a very subtle continuum of mind. There is that mind. That is there as a basis for everything. And because that is there, then all the appearances, the external appearances, can occur. And so it's just the mind. There aren't any other things out there, but there is just the mind. It is only the mind. And so they establish that everything is just the mind. If at the very beginning it was some presentation of things being nothingness, nihilistic emptiness with nothing at all, a blank emptiness, then there would be a danger there. So they said it's not that sort of emptiness. There is mind, it is just mind. And so in coming to understand that view, there's now a basis for there to be karma, cause, and effect. There's a basis to develop the love and compassion. And that basis is just the mind, the mirror of the mind.
Tene ta tetabu ta sensam pak tawa tela ta chiruji ngupo tongji sanji noala mulom tabu khargi yore ti tsawa ti nang semle sem tela kari yore sen sen number hipa chu ji se yore la sen number hipa chu ji de tangbo ta chi no non se kenge chi zula ta kenge make number hipa tene zu tongking Tene taken the Datunking, now number hepa, Jetson nine number hepa, Ro Yonking, J number hepa, Reason Yonking, Hiji number hepa, Reason Yonking, Luigi number hepa, te, that number hepa, go nga, Sitachi, Umbu Goni, Che Yurgen Nambalangus, Long Jepare, Che Yurgen Nambalangus, Long Jepare, the Inaya Tela. Zinbatan Hempandrabo Hiro Yomare Koran Par Tapanangi Melonganon the Zuni Herwanangi Dabote Shargi Yore Make Carbo Serbo Marbo Lasuba Tongi Yore Tongi Yore the Inayate Yapondo Samba Yapomendo Samba Tene Tuga on the Sena Kasang Ngupote, Tering Ngupote, Kasing Ngupote, Kasing Tongiore, Tering Ngupote, Tering Tongiore, Sani Ngupote, Sani Tongrimato, Kasing Ngupote, Tering Tongomare, Tering Ngupote, Sani Tongio Mare, La Koran tekala yuarete inaya tel gong number hiba se toming number la char tomgire ta tela yi number hiba se yuarela yi number hiba ti tokje imbe cherna tini ti kasan tang terin tang sanin tenzu tsur kasin tong deba tang terin tong deba tang sanin tong ju tenzu tsu damne ti ngubo teyen sambada wota tening ngubo tenzo la mainda jeba ta tanda penna make number hibi karin tong yore sina ngubo koran sam tong yore mat di mainde tana nyam do tong yo marete ina yo mainda dadan drinzin je topa se mainda ngubo teni tsursi ni zmbala soba tene tuba hiji number hiba tela topa chembo tene ta te tendam je onda sina tulba 출발하고 다지 제사살 전투를 로아인 베잖아 두바 이제 넘버 히바텔로 로토제시 다텔로 초두그 넘버 히바 숨기요래
So in the mind-only view, the external appearances just are perceptions of the mind. They're just like dreams, but the root of them is the mind. So how is it that the mind-only school describes the mind? They say that the mind has the 8 consciousnesses, and of the 8 consciousnesses, first there are the consciousnesses that perceive the external appearances. We have an eye consciousness that sees forms. So when we see forms, we see these with the eye consciousness. We also have an ear consciousness that hears sound, a nose consciousness that smells scents, a tongue consciousness that tastes flavors, and a body consciousness that feels touch. And so these 5 consciousnesses are the 5 consciousnesses of the 5 gates, the 5 sensory consciousness. And when we see things with our eyes or we hear things, we think, oh, that's out there. There's the appearance of the external object out there. And these are the consciousnesses that actually use, that actually enjoy, that actually rely upon the external consciousnesses. But while they see them, the eye sees something or you hear something, but there's not any attachment in that consciousness. It's just like it's snapping a picture, or it's just like seeing a reflection in the mirror. So the eye consciousnesses, for example, will see yellow, red, white, and all these colors and shapes, but it doesn't give any sort of a name to it. It doesn't say to it, that's good. It doesn't say that's bad. It doesn't say that's yesterday's, that's tomorrow's, that's today. Yesterday's, it saw yesterday's form yesterday. It sees today's forms today. It'll see tomorrow's form tomorrow. It does not see yesterday's form today. It will not see today's form tomorrow. It only sees today's. It only sees what's happening right now. Just right directly, that is how it sees it. And so that is how these 5 gate consciousnesses, the 5 sensory consciousnesses, work. So because they're like that, they're what we call non-conceptual consciousnesses. So these are the non-conceptual consciousnesses. But then there also is the 6th mental consciousness, which is a conceptual consciousness. And so the mental consciousness will see something now, it perceives something now, it thinks of the thing it perceived yesterday, it thinks of what it might perceive tomorrow, and it sort of puts them all together and say, okay, that's one thing, and then we give it a name. We give it a nice little label, and we think that that is the thing. Now, with the eye consciousness, it's just seeing the thing. It doesn't give it a name. So when we have a consciousness that combines the name with the object and puts them together into something, that is the mental consciousness that does that. The 6th mental consciousness is a consciousness that mixes the sound and meaning together. It mixes and confuses the two. So in that respect, ultimately, this consciousness is confused. And so the clearer and clearer it seems to get, the more confused it is. And so the first 5 sensory consciousness and the 6th consciousness together, these make the 6 consciousnesses.
Tene ta tupa hiji number hiba tela ta chitang netsul go on the sina trubal be gong number hiba le trur cher trubal non sul go on the sina ko chang du so Trungpa song, tene Trungpa hiji number hipa te mena, tene gong number hipa ki leka hito che shige yo mare la. Tene Trungpa hiji number hipa te mangpo che dom ne, che trol ne, zodu, tene ngaran so jitin ki chawa kanga truk tupa che zogi yo mare la. Teacher na Trungpa hiji number hipa te la tokje sungi yo mare. Tene ta te Trungpa hiji number hipa te ta te number hipa tsu trausi. Number hipa tsu trau te la jirdo number hipa tsu ji la desin rabu ni yo la tembe number hipa tong tene metembe number hipa te ni yo pe na ne number hipa tsu trau te metem pare kapka la hipa te jege yo re kapka la yang jege yo mare make number hipa yin na yo tawe kapsala make number hipa jege re metawe kapsala make number hipa jege mare dra tupe kapsala na number hipa jege re dra metupe kapsala na number hipa yo mare teni hiji number hipa yo nong tu njo kapsala hiji number hipa yo re nong tu menjo kapsala hiji number hipa yo mare teacher na tel tembe metembe number hipa si kapkala ye kapkala go kapkala che ta tende yonge yo re la ta number hipa ni de tembe number hipa re la tembe number hipa de dancing chawa nyemo bi sikite tu jondo ngaran sol ki tsang ji la nga nyong tun bate megi zo tona yonda zo ma tona yonda nawe da tu na yonda ma tu na yonda non to rapa njo na yonda non to rapa ma njo na yonda nga nyong bate meji ba ye bate la tene ta te la nyemo bi ye se ge yo la nyemo thongchi ke chawa ta bote chawa che te megewa revisi na megewa mare luma tembare luma tembare te yinaya tharba tong thamchin chembala dribgi revisi na dribgi yo are timu bichare dribla luma ten si te la nomin nyemban rabu chege yo are revisi na nomin nyemba chege yo mare teacher na luma ten re yinaya tanda dancing ke tsawa jing bichi na nyemu ba kanga ke jun rabu che shege yo are la tene sato pe chongchu semba ke te pangru yo are la te pardo la ko tempo dege yo are la teacher na te la nyemu be shege yo are ta ti tendo kinhi number hipa shege yo are la kinhi number hipa te sam sal tsam rai tsam ta ngaran tu jondo mege zo thona ya mantona ya nawe dra tu na ya ma tu na ya se ge no tu njo na ya manjo na ya sem ge sarcha te ta kanga hipa ji ma to tin ngaran do no gi bembo na gi choya yo mare la te me pa te kinhi number hipa te tembe number hipa ta ti ten la pacha tenzo yo ne tene kanga mahompa la jeju yo pa mahompa la no har ju yo pa ta tende yung ge chena tela kinhi number hipa se ta tela senson pe kan dembar truba ta chawan da bote kanden zinge yo le sen kinhi number hipa thawa te dembar truba re te cham ge re ma to chudu rapa te ya ta thawa ke ji ge ma to chudu rapa te yo tanda hipa keji chami imbichina dembar madu pare la tene chei nongwa tene zongwa dutrin chami madu pichina zunba re mulam tabu re re ti ina yon tsawa kunhi nambar hipa ti yuwa re sal tsam rei tsam tsu su malung wache yuwa re tela tene shargi yuwa re tela tene tang korwe ke chunong tong tene korwe chunong tong chal ne sanji ke kompong tawya tena re sungi yuwa re re sungi yuwa re di ina ya ti da ribisi na da ma re kongsa ka da ma re kari risi na da ti ngaran sugi nzimba ti da dan nzimba ka sulu ngubo do do rabu jai leka chenkin namtu unjunkin jai songi yuwa re la tindi yuwa ma re ngo tongpa rabu tini yuwa pichar na kinji nambar hipa ti keji me rangi chenchi yuwa re keji me rangi chenchi yuwa pati dembar truba re somne tena pavge yuwa re la ta ti sensompe tawa tsawan rabu ti kinji nambar hipa dendro tu kelempa re teacher na ngupur nawa se toni de nawa to ngupur nawa ni ye pe non sensom pa te toni de nawa mare tsawa kinji number hipa te dembar truban rabon zinge yore ta ting ji ting khoru ge tongwa tam che jungsu se ge tsawan rabo te hyal ji gi yore.
So the sixth mental consciousness, in terms of the way it actually is, it is confused, but in terms of how it appears, it is different. And so in terms of it is confused about the appearance. So in terms of it is confused in terms of the way it appears, but in terms of how things, excuse me, I'm going to start again. Okay. The sixth mental consciousness is in terms of the nature of things, the way things actually are. It is confusion. But even though it is confusion ultimately, in terms of how things appear, it is actually very useful. It is what allows us to put things together and to do them. Because we can't really do, without a mental consciousness, we wouldn't be able to think things through. We wouldn't be able to do anything. So we'd have these 5 sensory consciousnesses, but they wouldn't be able to do anything, to function in any way. And so the sixth consciousness brings them all together and then allows us to get things done, to do work. And so that is how this sixth mental consciousness is conceptual. And so we have that sixth mental consciousness. In this way, we have the first 5 consciousness, the sensory consciousness, and the sixth mental consciousness for 6 consciousnesses. Now, when we talk about 8 consciousnesses, there are 2 different types of consciousnesses there. There are the stable consciousnesses and the enduring consciousnesses and the unenduring consciousnesses, or the stable and unstable consciousnesses. And the 6 consciousnesses are unstable consciousnesses. The reason is that sometimes there is a cognition there and sometimes there isn't. Sometimes you're thinking of sometimes you're not. When you're looking at things with your eye, when you're looking, then there's an eye consciousness going. When you're not looking at anything, there's no eye consciousness. When there's a sound, when you hear a sound, there's an ear consciousness, but when you're not hearing a sound, the ear consciousness is not there. So sometimes it's there, sometimes it's not. Likewise, with our sixth consciousness, when we have thoughts that are occurring, then there is a sixth consciousness there. But when you aren't thinking of anything, there's no sixth consciousness present. And so they are not stable, they're not enduring and always present. So sometimes they're there, sometimes they're not. So these are the 6 unstable consciousnesses, and then there are 2 stable consciousnesses. And these stable, the first of these is the subtle clinging to a self, which is the afflicted mind. There's this subtle sense of clinging to me, thinking I'm here, perceiving me all the time. And so whether we are seeing a form or not, whether we are hearing a sound or not, whether or not we are having some sort of a thought, there always is a subtle sense of me that's there. There you have the sense, I'm here, there's me, I'm right here. And so that is the afflicted mind. This is the subtle root out of which all of the other afflictions can arise. But even though we call it the afflicted consciousness, does that mean that it's non-virtuous? It isn't necessarily non-virtuous, it's actually neutral. But if it's neutral, does that mean that it does not obscure us from attaining liberation and omniscience? Well, it is obscured. It does obscure us from that, and so for that reason, we call it obscured neutral. So it is called obscured neutral because having it prevents us from attaining liberation and omniscience. It's neutral because it doesn't have any power to create any karmic ripening, but because it obscures us from attaining liberation and omniscience, it is obscured, and it is something that the bodhisattvas who are progressing through the bodhisattva levels do have to abandon. But until such time as we do abandon it, then it is stable, and so that is the 7th consciousness, the afflicted consciousness. Then the 8th consciousness is the ground consciousness. And this is just, the ground consciousness is just the mere awareness, the mere clarity of the mind. Just mere clarity, mere awareness of the mind. And so whether or not we are seeing something at the moment, whether we're hearing something at the moment, whether a thought is occurring at a moment, at that moment or not, there is always that clarity of the mind that is present. There's subtle clarity of the mind that's always present. It's not like when we aren't seeing things that we just become inanimate and dead like a rock or something like that. That's not how it happens. This ground consciousness is stable and enduring. It's where all of the imprints or habitual tendencies, all of the imprints we have are made, and it's so everything that appears arises out of this. It's because of this that everything can occur, and so this is the ground consciousness. And so, when we say that the mind-only school says that there's a mind and that mind truly exists, then what is it that they mean when they say the mind? Well, what they are talking about is this ground consciousness. They say that the ground consciousness truly exists, but that is all they say truly exists. They say for the 6 consciousnesses, they say these are coarse consciousnesses. They are made up of the indivisible instance of time, and so therefore they cannot be truly established as existing. They exist relatively, but not ultimately. Similarly, all the things that appear outside are made up of atoms, so they don't really, they're just many things brought together. And so there's just perception of them. We have perceptions of them. They're like fixations. They're like dreams, but they don't truly exist. But the basis for all of this is the ground consciousness that's always present. There always is that clarity, that awareness that's present. So, but it is not something outside of ourselves. It's because of thinking there are things outside that we then get confused and wander in samsara. But when we rid ourselves of that confusion, then we can become Buddhas. Now, is this 8th consciousness of the mind only, is that a self? Well, it's not a self. When we think of a self as being a single thing, a solid thing that can function, that can do things, it's what will do all of our work for us. It's what thinks and things like that. But the mind-only school says that the ground consciousness is momentary. It's changing from moment to moment to moment. So the mind consciousness is momentary, and therefore it can't be truly established as being a self. And so in this way, this is the basic view of the mind only. They say that there is a ground consciousness that has real existence. And so for this reason, we say that they are a school that they say that they are a school that assert that things exist. So you can have schools that assert that everything is emptiness and schools that assert that things exist. And of these two, the mind only is not a school that asserts everything is emptiness, because they assert that because they cling to the ground consciousness as truly existing, and they explain it as being the root of all samsara.
Tene ta telaya ta tanda kapndersona telaya number tamji to samsung the dembran de namdin pata number tamji chino kondo yo madu zimbar kelemba namzimba ni samsung tawa la hibar chena ni yore ni yabata karire sena ta chitang che ngubo tenzo duldu tuba yo mare che ngubo tuba yo mare nang samla ten hyarge yore nang samla ten hyardu hyalu mandawa ni yore la hyalu mandawa ni yabata karire sena cheite nang sam ter ha zug nambala hyarne zug da terrorism nambala hyarne ta zug da terrorism ngote tini sen ran imbala Demba and was San Rain Barkelem Batilla, Sanson Nom Demba, Sewa Jada. Tene Taya, the chirurgeon Upotenzo, Shargi Yorella, the Che Dulginambala, you to your Rebesina, you to your mare. Non Sanginambala, you are Rebesina, your mare. Tagasi Chio Mape Nambala, Sharwa, Tendage Race in the Tassan Tulni, Nimbo Mepa, the Wotia Mepa, the Wote, Zumba Nambala, Sharwarisa, Nomzimbati, Chitanga, Sansambala, Tuntandabo number Niore. Number ni yobate ya ta kun number ni ki ge zawati ta sen yin bala keleng yore teni ta ti ge sen zong nom ding ba tong nom jing ba ni de Tony the Tena Papa on the Siena, Nomzin Party, Chirurgical Pote, Kaya, Mepanda Tena Papa Sena, Tenete, sense of Nomzin Party, Tawa Toa, Dabotele, you are a song you are. You are the Yina Uni, repeat do you do tell there's a top there at the sense of Nomdin by your non sent number la, Hargi you are la. Teacher na sense namding ba de te top there at the Dambanda Boche. You are raised on the Mipham Rinpoche, Omajing driven na sense namding ba de Zon the Boche now you are.
And so what it says here, starting from the middle of the last line on page 2, what it says here is that there are two mind-only schools, the true aspectarians, who assert that all aspects are true as merely mind, and the false aspectarians, who assert that all aspects are false and do not exist either inside or outside. And so if we look at the if we look really closely at the mind-only school, well, what do we find? Well, there are two different parts, and two parts of it. And so some of them say that when you look at the true aspectarians, say that when you look at external things, they cannot be established as external things. And so when they cannot be established things, they just appear, they occur because of the mind. And when there are two different ways that they can occur to the mind. So the first way that they can occur is as presented by the true aspectarians. They say that all these appearances are mind. And so when we have an appearance of an external form, or an appearance of a sound, an appearance of a scent, or of a taste, or of a touch, or something, then these appearances happen. There's an aspect of them appearing in our mind, a sort of image of them appearing in our mind, but the essence of that is just the mind itself. It's so like an aspect, so when we see something, it's just an aspect of the mind, and they say that that's true, that that's the mind, and so that is why they're called the true aspectarians. They say these aspects are true. Then the other school says that when these external appearances occur, when they occur, well, can they be established as being actual atoms? They can't be established as atoms, but they're not really mind either. They can't really be established as mind. There's these aspects that appear, but it's actually not really anything. It's just nothing. It's confusion and nothingness that's appearing like a dream. So it's just the confusion of the mind. And so they say that these aspects that appear are false, and so they're called the false aspectarians. And so in this way we have these two different schools of the mind only school. And so both of these say that the mind is the root of anything. They both assert that the root of the mind is everything. And when we talk about these two different schools, the true aspectarians and the false aspectarians, then when, in terms of coming to understand that everything is emptiness, then since the false aspectarian says that the external things do not have any existence at all, then they are considered to be somewhat higher in that respect. However, when you actually come to try to prove their view logically, it's kind of difficult. And so for that reason, it's a little bit easier to take the view of the true aspectarians and just say that all of the appearances are appearances of the mind that truly exists. So the aspect. So when I say aspect here, what it means is just like the image of something you see in the mind. So it's like these images you see in the mind are just mind. They're truly there. And so this is easier to understand, easier to work with. And so for that reason, Mipham Rinpoche, in his commentary on the Middle Way, says that when you follow the Middle Way, you primarily use this Middle Way view of the true aspectarians.
Tene ta te kapndar songna te ni tumo zong de hisi chu tong ji kon da yong yong du som je kong su de te na pa pa tan te ta ti sen zong pe ta wa nguma la kan de yo are se na kun da yong yong rup sing ki je na ba som sung yo are la tene ta ti tang che tang ji ting ge no an de char tong tene ji ting ge no an de char ne ti ge natural kari yo pa te la kun da yong yong rup som sung yo are 다텔라 군도 생긴데 간데지리세나 대야 중진 정치 등등바 군도세 치중의 열다 열진 넘발라 혀와 대다 난즘베 셈 다텔 땅킹게 셈니 지 넘발라 혀게 요아래라 디니 단당 문이 내땅가 온드세는 ngojibarede perna mulamje kapsalaya che re nambala hargere re nambala hardu tela de semle losu jur reji yoarbisini yomare sem ni re nambala hargi yorela tini teacher na di sen mulamga kapsalaya che yurje nambad reti ngaran le tateba reji hargi yoarbisini hargi yore 다 대답을 끊다래 단단 나란주 노알라야 치 열진 넘바디 치 중의 열도 논좀 베세니 정치든 좀 바지 소소 타디든 좀 바지 요아래라 대 끊다래 끊다시 다디 루타파 정기레 마도 되네 요마래 다오나 카리 요아래세나 히바니 준진니 노아 좀바 예왕예 드니 샘데 치 열진 넘발라 샤르좀 요아래세나 데 샤르좀 요아래라디 레지 온게 드니 텐드지 온게 코라 샤르데게 요아래라디 예왕세게 요아 샤르좀 기레 마도 띵우니게 돌도트바도 덴버트바 요아래세나 드니 덴버트바 요마래라 돌도트바 요마래 예원라 kuntaji tombe chala yongdubdunde tini ti zunzin jongshi de nguni yoarbese나 yo marela ti tombati yongdub yen yimbarnde la tini kuntati kunzo 주만 다보지래 예원라 내출 동 농출 니서 체외 내출 농출 온진도 세나 군조비 내출 온진도 세나 단담도 도와예 세두 농출 온진도 세두 되네 단다 샤르와티 노아 샤르와티 칸디데세나 문이 예니 샤르와티 말에 메니 샤르와티 임베체나 군조브레 내출 온진도 세두 텔라다 코란 토니 그고니 샤르데게 요아레라 디 단담레 수기
And so both of these schools, the true aspectarian and the false aspectarian, both of them are similar in establishing that all knowable phenomena can be classified as imaginary, dependent, and wholly established. And so here we have all of the phenomena of the world, and generally all the phenomena of the world can be established as being one of the three characteristics of either imaginary, dependent, or wholly established. So when there is the way the world appears to us, and when it appears to us, there is the way that it actually is. And these are described by these three characteristics of imaginary, dependent, and wholly established. When we talk about the established, the imaginary, it says here, they, meaning the mind only, assert that the imaginary is holding the perceiver and perceived to be completely separate. And so when we see things, we perceive an external object. There's a perceived object that we think of as outside of ourselves, and then there is the perceiver, the mind, the internal mind. And when we look at these things, normally we think of these two as being separate. Actually, in how they, the way they actually are, in their nature, they are the same in the essence. The appearances are just like dreams. In a dream, you might see things might appear as being outside of yourselves. You might dream of a mountain or whatever. But is that mountain you dream of separate from your mind in any way? It isn't separate from your mind in any way. It's just the mind. It's just an appearance of the mind itself. In the same way, with all our external appearances, all the perceived things, the mountains and so forth, they appear to be far away from a separate. From ourselves and different from ourselves. And when they appear to be different from ourselves, that's what we call the imaginary. So the imaginary is when we perceive things as being separate from ourselves. That's called the imaginary. It's like it's made up. We've just made it up with our minds. It's not truly established in any way. The second of these characteristics is the dependent. It says, the dependent is the mere dualistic appearance of mental cognition as perceiver and perceived. And so when the mind perceives things, the there are the external objects that just merely appear. And when they appear in dependence upon karma and interdependence. And so that is why it's called the dependent. Things appear in dependence upon karma and interdependence. They just merely appear. Can they be established as particles? Can they be established as true? They can't. That is the dependent. It's just the dependent is just the mere appearance. And then the wholly established is the part of the dependent that is empty of the imaginary. So if you take away all the imaginary and you're just left with the empty nature of the dependent, that is what is called the wholly established. So that emptiness is the wholly established. So here, the imaginary is relative. So the imaginary is always relative, and then the dependent can be either relative or ultimate truth. So the dependent is in terms of the way things appear. So if you just look at how things appear, the dependent is relative. But if you actually look at the actual nature of things, the emptiness nature of things, then it is ultimate truth. And then the wholly established is unilaterally ultimate truth. And so when things appear to us, the way they appear, it's not as if they appear to us from being something that truly exists and then appearing. That's not how it is. It's things that don't truly exist but appear. And so when something doesn't exist and it appears as if it does, then that is relative truth. And in terms of the way things actually are, in terms of their nature, they are emptiness, and so thus it is ultimate truth.
Tene ta tejendu yongru taje to tendom to kelang ne shiza tamji dot me par de jong ta te yongru te taje to tendom pa yin sen som ne sen som pe chal ji yore la tene shiza tamji dot me par de pa de ta khonsa ga da yo mare la chu ji da mi jong to pa re ta tanda chu tamji no tamji toni de ten la pa ge yore sung ge yore sung yore de korndeje takam darsam nan korndeje no na cho bande no ye ta mang korwa yar nyangin linde pa no number na cho ba no ye hipa rangri rangsal ta tanda konti hipa yin to kin number hipa cham ye denrup to ke lompe ta ti chawan ra bo ji gu do go wa zawati yo la te yo be pe ta tunta koma be yalna chudo tawa mato be chuji danzin jitang ke to yo re senson be ta nyin tu pa tam ji chuji dami to yo mare song yo re kap kal ten chu kha hi na to yo re song yo re din na ti rapa chong ji to bare 다 단다 니 센점비 추지 도미 또 요르베스나 또 요레 숭게 요레디 이나야 티 실로 요레 다디 타와 가리 로 요레스나 타와 그이 넘버 히바 된도 켈람바티 차니 타와티 마토피 탐지 쳔벨람 용타바 메 송네 오면 로벤 쳔보 넘지 각관제도 다디 탐진 쳔바 조부선지 가신 휴바긴다 타르바동 탐진 쳔바 레브니 요레 디나니 닌투바 탐지라 타르바토야 요레 탐진 쳔바 산지지 공봉토 두기요 마레 송니 휴바레라 디옌도 단다 테니 추지 도미 타와 추지 도 타와 제긴 좀바예 베잖아 탐진 쳔바 산지지 공봉티 용다바 메 송니 오면 로벤 남지 각관제도 송니 다디 센som 베타와티
So the wholly established is unilaterally ultimate. So these schools accept that all phenomena are selfless. So here they say that the wholly established is the ultimate truth. This is what the mind only presents. And then all knowable phenomena, everything that can be known, are selfless. They lack a self. So they realize that there is no individual self, and they also realize the selflessness of phenomena, or that appearances are emptiness, or so they say. So they say that they have realized when they say that they've realized the selflessness of the phenomena. As it says here, they assert that the basis of all the various appearances of samsara, that is the low ordinary phenomena, and nirvana, the higher phenomena, the self-aware and self-illuminating mind truly exists. So the self-aware and self-illuminating mind, that is just merely the ground consciousness, the mere ground consciousness. And they say that it truly exists, that there is, that it is a basis for everything. They do not realize subtle selflessness are evaluated from the perspective of the middle way. So when we say that they realize the selflessness of phenomena, then when we talked about the views of the foundation school yesterday, we said that sometimes it is said that the arhats, for example, realize the selflessness of phenomena, but that is just gross phenomena. It's not the subtle phenomena. And when we talk about the mind-only school, do they realize the selflessness of phenomena? Well, yes, they do, but there's a little bit left. There's a tiny bit that they haven't quite realized. And that tiny bit that they haven't realized is because they assert that the ground consciousness is truly existent. So there's this subtle aspect that they have not realized. So, as we said yesterday, there are two results that we can have: liberation and omniscience. And so, therefore, the great masters of the middle way refute the mind-only path, saying that through it there is no genuine path to complete liberation. So, as we said yesterday, there is liberation and omniscience. And with the views of the foundation vehicle, then they are able to attain liberation, but through those views you aren't able to attain omniscience. And similarly, with the mind-only school, because they have this subtle clinging to a phenomenal self, then they can't properly come to a realization of omniscience. And so, for this reason, the middle way masters say that there is not that it is not a genuine path to omniscience and complete liberation. So that is the discussion of the middle way view. Oh, that's it. Okay. So that is enough for this morning, and now I need to take actually a little bit of a break myself, but please make all the preparations for the refuge ceremony, and I'll come back from my break, and then we'll have the refuge ceremony.